for 2021, Triumph have made the Speed Triple a lot more punchy. They've added about 30 horsepower, which is a huge boost, and it makes for a much more aggressive motorcycle. So is it still a good bike for the road, or is it now too hot to handle? In this video, I'll tell you what I thought after riding it for a week on the road exclusively. I'd been really looking forward to this one, and there were certainly plenty of things I liked about it, as well as a few little points that might be improved. I also tested one of its closest competitors recently, the 1290 Super Duke R. That bike was incredible too, so at the end, I'll tell you how they compare, but first a word on the setup. Now, given how much sort of motorcycle media I consume and the fact that the launch for this bike was a few weeks ago, about a month I guess, I haven't been able to avoid seeing some of the reviews, and I think a few of the comments came up saying it was quite hardcore, pretty focused, fast, track orientated. As soon as I got it, I thought I'm probably gonna have to dial back some of the adjustments here. So I checked the brake ratio. It's a span and ratio adjustable lever. Made sure that was backed off to the lowest setting so that it was more friendly in the delivery of braking power. I also checked the suspension. So there's a bunch of suggested settings for track riding, for road riding, and there's a comfort setting. And I even went into the rider configurable riding mode, and I did try road ABS, which is kind of the default, road traction control as well, but then rain for the throttle map. The problem with that is that although it does feel like it gives you a more gradual delivery of power, it's capped at 100 PS. And look, I'm not gonna borrow a Speed Triple for a week and ride around with 100 PS. So road was the best riding mode. So with those settings, the Speed Triple 1200 RS gives you exactly what you'd want from a Super Naked. It's sharp handling and taut, but for me still manageable, and there's just enough comfort there for a decent day in the saddle. I certainly enjoyed a good few blasts around South Wales, and so here are 6 of the things that I loved about it, and a couple I didn't. So we've got to start by talking about the 1200 inline triple engine, which is just astonishing. There's so much power at the top end that you're just never ever going to be wanting more for road riding, certainly. I guess the big selling point of this bike though is compared to something like the MV Agusta Brutale 1000RR or the CB 1000R, I had that recently as well. Both of those bikes can feel a bit uninspiring lower in the revs. This has that nice creamy torquey feel to it, and it really feels like you can just ride it in third along some B roads and it won't get bogged down or unresponsive lower in the revs. You can just get on the gas from the bottom of the rev range right up to the top, and it's just an absolute blast at whatever revs you're riding it. In contrast to the KTM as well, this feels a little bit smoother, so it has a more refined feel without losing any of that hooliganism that it has, when you're really gassing it. When I say refined, I don't mean boring. I just mean that when you're cruising along and, taking in a bit of motorway to get between the good roads, it's a very nice, smooth bike to ride. When you do hit the twisties though, like I say, the throttle response, even in road, let alone sport or track or whatever, it's very, very, very lively on the throttle. I guess I'd sum it up by saying you will never be bored riding this bike. Whatever speed you're going at, there's power, there's torque, there's a lot of response, like I say, and it's just, it's absolutely nuts. And of course, a huge part of the riding experience is the soundtrack. And yet again, Triumph have done wonders with this stock exhaust. At the moment, they seem to be offering fewer and fewer bikes with an accessory exhaust, be that from Vance and Hines they used to have for the modern classics, or Arrow for the Tiger and the Roadsters like this. This is one of the bikes that doesn't have one. The Trident as well, they don't offer one. And I think what they're saying is that Euro 5 is so restrictive, the emissions regulations, in terms of both the sound and the emissions, that there's not really a lot they can do with an aftermarket silencer. It doesn't really add anything in terms of performance, and therefore it doesn't really give the customer great value for money. I think that's good to hear. And also, most of the stock bikes sound absolutely incredible, be that the modern classics, the Street Twin and those sorts of bikes. They all sound great right out of the box. I remember being on the Street Triple RS launch just last year as well. What an incredible sounding stock exhaust with a nice little carbon finisher. This one though, this is the first I think that they've done to my knowledge anyway, with an exhaust control valve. So you might have seen that on something like the Africa Twin or the Fireblade. What it does basically is closes at lower revs, adds a bit of torque and efficiency, but as you get on the gas, it really opens up into like a throaty triple roar, which is exactly what you want from this bike. And combined with the sound that you're getting from the airbox as well, it's absolutely beautiful. I wish my Trident sounded like this. Maybe I can see if I can fit one of these bad boys. On top of that, the gearbox is pretty damn good as well. I think it likes to be a bit further up in the revs, and you've got the quick shifter as well. I've found that, you know, once the speed picks up, it's just perfection. I wouldn't say it's the best at low revs and town speeds, and occasionally I struggle to find neutral with it, but for the sort of riding that it's intended for, it performs beautifully. Another plus for this bike for me as well is the handling and braking and just the kind of general performance out on the road. You know, it's easily good enough for most road riding at a decent clip, and like I say, you do have to back it off a bit to get that comfort on the road. I think if it was in anything firmer than the comfort settings, it might become a bit jarring and tiring after a while, but in those settings I found it to be just that perfect level of like responsive and not kind of wallowy. You know, it's what you want from a super naked, but there's just enough to stop you getting kind of fed up of it. I did a good 5 hours of riding yesterday around South Wales. Some of the roads down there, they're not great in terms of the surfaces, and I like to try and pick my way through a variety of lanes and B roads and A roads and a bit of motorway. I found it absolutely fine for a full day riding like that. The brakes as well, I had a good chance to test them out. I don't think you'd expect anything else from this setup. You know, Brembos at the front, the Stylemas, braided hoses, a Brembo radial master cylinder. It's all the good stuff, and it brakes just as well as you'd expect. One more subtle thing is it does have linked braking, so it gives you a bit of rear brake when you're on the front brakes. I think the rear brake is left independent when you use the foot control though, so if you do want to drag it doing low speed maneuvers and that kind of thing, you can do. I've got to say, I didn't even really notice it, and I only remembered about that feature from talking to Stuart Wood, the chief engineer at Triumph, at the launch of this bike, and he said to me, look, don't even think about it, it's just working in the background. We've proven that it shortens stopping distances, and you probably won't even notice that it's happening or doing anything, and that's absolutely true. So I think that's I guess that's a big positive for this bike. You know, it's not a link braking system like you get on like a little cheap 125 or something. It's proper subtle and well engineered. I'd also say the riding position is pretty amenable as well. You know, it's exactly what you'd expect from a speed triple, I guess. A bit tall in the seat, nice and wide in the bars, not too hunched over. Foot pegs again, you know, sporty but not totally uncompromising, and I find the seats quite nice in that it's narrow at the front. You can slide down when you're around town and in traffic and get your feet down easily, but it really pitches up and widens towards the back so that you can shift and get a little bit further forward. At this price point of around 15 grand and being a super naked, this bike has all the tech that you'd expect it to. So lean sensitive rider aids, plenty of riding modes, so rain, road, sport, track, rider configurable, lots of ability to kind of customize it all. You have got cruise control as well and phone connectivity where you can get your nav and media on the dash, a 5-inch TFT dash, but really it's not all about like creature comforts like heated grips and stuff. It's focused on performance riding. In the tech department, I think the big advantage that other bikes might have over this, like the Street Fighter V4, is the semi-active electronically adjustable Öhlins suspension on it, but that bike is significantly more expensive than this, and Triumph made the call not to fit that stuff to try and keep the cost of this bike reasonable. They also said not many customers asked for it when they sort of focus grouped or surveyed them in the development of this bike, so that's fair enough. I guess the semi-active would be a big advantage for motorway miles, then twisties, then motorway miles, then twisties, and you want to switch between comfort and firmness on a really frequent basis. But 15 grand is a lot more achievable than 20 for a lot of people, so it is understandable. Last up in the likes column for this bike would be the finish and the looks of it. It's classic Triumph in terms of the quality of the finish. Lots of nice little touches everywhere. There isn't really anything that looks cheap about it or where corners have been cut. Everything is beautifully made, really nicely spec'd, really nicely finished. I particularly like the paint job on this one. I know it's not the most pop-in. If you want something really bright and loud and more angular, there's always the KTM, but for me this is like a slightly more subdued, almost like a sleeper type vibe. You know, it doesn't shout about its performance in a visual way, but obviously underneath it all, it's an absolute weapon. And in terms of the touches I like, you know, you've got the carbon front mudguard. I think the headlights that first appeared in that style on the Street Triple have transferred over really nicely here. I actually like it without the fly screen that used to come as standard as well. I think it's an accessory now, but I like that clean look to the front end. There's a nice choice of sort of brush finish on the footrests and heel guards and the pillion pegs and the subframe. It's got a pointed, aggressive looking tail end with that pillion seat cover, and there's also the M-shaped LED tail light. The stock exhaust has a nice look to it as well, and of course, I'm always a big fan of a single-sided swing arm, and it all combines for like a beefier looking version of a Street Triple essentially. I think it's a big improvement over the previous gen that was starting to look a little bit dated. It's bang up to date, very classy looking and beautifully finished. As for stuff that I didn't like so much about this bike, the design and layout of the graphics in the TFT dash are not perfect for me. The physical dash itself, you know, has good contrast, it's a decent size, the surround is nicely designed, but actually the sort of visual layout on the screen isn't perfect. It's like a round dial with the speed in the middle and the gear position, and it just feels like a lot of wasted space in a rectangle around it. Now granted, when you go into the nav or the trip meter, it puts them side by side, but I like to have like a simple view for when you are pushing on a bit where you can see revs, speed, gear as easily as possible at a quick glance. If you compare it to something like a BMW dash, I just had the 1250 GS for example, that makes really good use of the space on the screen there, and it's very simple and punchy and clear. The Street Triple and the Tiger, they have more options in terms of the layout, and I think they make better use of a rectangular screen, so hopefully there's a software update or something coming to make it a bit more big and bold. And it does lag a little. There are quite a few animations as you go between menus and stuff, and I think it's a bit like when your phone is getting a bit old and slowing down. Perhaps the hardware isn't quite up to the task of doing those animations. Like I say, I'm not bothered about fancy animations. I just want like simple, readable data on that screen as easy as possible. That's definitely the biggest one for me. There are some other minor things. The clutch lever waggles a bit, which can be a bit of a distraction when you're riding. The engine doesn't love being below sort of like 3,000 revs. It starts to feel a bit rough, so you do need to slip the clutch a bit if you want to smooth it out. You know, but overall there are definitely things you can live with, especially on a performance orientated bike like this where you're not going to be doing a lot of urban miles on it, or I hope not anyway. It's just that my one big wish would be an update to the dash to something a little simpler, even just as an option, you know, switch between layouts. But for me, the positives far outweigh the negatives with this bike, with that engine, the lightness and handling, and all in a package that I think is mean looking yet tastefully done. So if you've got 15 grand in your pocket and a need for speed, it should certainly be on your shortlist. But what about the KTM? Personally, I got on with it very well indeed, and in most areas the two bikes are pretty evenly matched. The level of spec, the suite of electronics, the price, and even the power output are all close enough to make it a substantial predicament. For me, the key difference comes down to the way that their respective engines feel. The V-twin in the KTM makes its power and torque a smidge lower down, which does give it the edge in terms of gutsiness. But as for this big 1200 triple, if you want a super naked that screams at the top, but without that low-end sacrifice that you often get with an inline 4, then look no further.